The wind in Havenwood carried a bite that winter evening, the kind that nipped at your ears and slid like a cold blade down the back of your neck, no matter how tightly you buttoned your coat. It was the sort of cold that didn't just chill the body but sank into the bones of the town itself, a small, forgotten place at the edge of nowhere, where the sun dipped early behind skeletal trees and the streetlights flickered with a sluggish pulse, as if they, too, were tired of trying. Havenwood had once been a thriving hub, its heart fueled by the lumber mills that lined the river decades ago. But the mills had closed, the jobs had vanished, and now the town wore its decay like an old coat frayed, patched, but still clinging to the shoulders of those who stayed dot at the far end of a cracked sidewalk where the pavement gave weight. Frostbitten grass stood an old bus stop, its bench sagging under the weight of time and neglect. People passed it as they always did, some with grocery bags tugging at their wrists, others with eyes glued to their phones, most hurrying to beat the dark that settled too quickly this time of year. No one lingered. No one noticed the figure, standing there, small and still, wrapped in a beige woolen coat that had seen better decades. Her silver hair poked out from beneath a knit cap, once white but now stained the color of dishwater, and her hands clutched a tattered leather purse as if it were her only anchor to the world. She turned her head with every passing car, her lips moving in a faint murmur something about the number 12 route, a street that didn't quite match the map of Havenwood. Ethan Carter saw her first from across the street, though he hadn't meant to. He was 18, a wiry figure stretched thin by hunger and time, his frame draped in a faded hoodie that had survived too many winters and a pair of sneakers held together by stubbornness more than thread. His mother's old bicycle leaned against a lamppost behind him, its rusted chain creaking with every turn, its back rack wobbling like it might give up at any moment. It was all he had left of her Lillian Carter, who'd raised him alone in a one-room apartment until cancer took her 2 years ago, leaving behind a bike, a few photographs, and a small pile of medical bills that Ethan was still paying off with every delivery he made. He worked the only way he knew how, pedaling through Havenwood's narrow streets, delivering parcels, groceries, prescriptions, anything that paid. Enough to keep the key to his boarding house room fitting the lock. The pay was barely enough to scrape by, but Ethan moved with a quiet urgency, as if stopping too long might let the weight of his life catch up. That evening, he was on his final delivery of the day, a small package of insulin for an elderly man on Birch Street. If he made it before 8 p.m., he'd have just enough to pay his week's rent to Mr. Callahan, the landlord whose patience was as thin as the walls of the boarding house. Callahan had made it clear. Missed the deadline, and the key would be useless. By morning, Ethan tightened the strap of his delivery bag across his chest, the canvas worn soft from use, and took a sip from a dented metal water bottle. He'd stopped at Mitchell's Market, a corner store with flickering neon signs and shelves stocked with canned goods and day-old bread. The owner, Hank Mitchell, was a gruff man in his 60s, his face creased from years of squinting at ledgers. But he had a soft spot for kids like Ethan, kids who worked hard and didn't ask for pity. Hank was behind the counter, wiping down a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration, when Ethan stepped inside to refill his bottle. "Last run of the night?" Hank asked, his voice a low rumble like gravel under tires. Ethan nodded, screwing the cap back on his bottle. "Birch Street. Gotta make it quick." Hank grunted, tossing a stale dinner roll across the counter. "Eat something. You're all bones, kid." Ethan caught the roll with a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks, Hank." He tore off a piece, chewing slowly as he glanced out the window. The town was exhaling into dusk, steam rising from the hoods of parked cars, children trudging home with backpacks slung low. He should have been on his bike already, pedaling toward Birch Street, but something held him there, a flicker of movement at the bus stop across the road. The old woman hadn't moved. She stood there, turning her head left, then right, her mouth still moving, her hands gripping the purse tighter. Every few moments, she took a hesitant step toward the curb, only to shuffle back, her face clouded with confusion. Ethan watched her, his fingers pausing on the roll. She wasn't just waiting, she was lost. The kind of lost that wasn't about streets or buses, but something deeper, something that made her look like she didn't belong to the world around her. He glanced at his phone. 7:42 p.m., 18 minutes. To make the delivery, pay Callahan, keep his room. 80 minutes to keep the cold at bay. But the woman's stillness tugged at him, like a hook caught in his chest. He remembered his mother, Lillian, standing at their old apartment window, staring out at nothing after a double shift at the hospital. She'd always stopped for people, strangers, neighbors, anyone who needed a moment of her time. You don't walk away from someone who's lost, she told him once, her voice soft but firm. Not if you can help it. Ethan shoved the rest of the roll into his mouth, slung his bag over his shoulder, and pushed open the door, the bell jingling faintly behind him. The cold hit him like a slap, but he ignored it, crossing the street with his bike rattling beside him. The woman didn't notice him at first, her eyes fixed on a passing truck, her lips murmuring something about Laurel Street and Bus 12. Ethan slowed, keeping his distance so as not to startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, softly, his voice barely louder than the wind. "You okay?" She blinked at him, her eyes pale and watery, like they were searching for a memory just out of reach. "I'm trying to get home," she said, her voice light and wandering, like a leaf caught in a breeze. "But I think I missed the bus, or maybe it missed me." She laughed, a small, brittle sound, like glass threatening to crack. Ethan nodded, his breath fogging in the air. "Where do you live? Maybe I can help." She looked down at her purse, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. A handkerchief spilled out, then a capless lipstick, a few coins, a bus transfer from 2 days ago. Number. Address. Ethan's heart sank a little, but then he noticed something glinting at her neck, a delicate silver chain with a small oval pendant resting against her coat. He leaned closer, squinting in the dim streetlight. Engraved in elegant cursive were the words, "Margaret Harper, 48 Pinecrest Drive, North Side." His breath caught. Pinecrest Drive. He knew the area way out past the edge of town, a good 2 hours by bike, most of it uphill through winding, poorly lit roads. The clock in his head ticked louder. 7:46 p.m., 14 minutes left. He could still make the delivery if he sprinted, but Pinecrest was in the opposite direction. Helping her meant missing the deadline, losing his room, sleeping in the cold. He thought of Callahan's face, the man's thin lips curling as he tossed Ethan's belongings onto the porch. He thought of his mother's voice, her hands folding a blanket around him on a night much like this one. The woman, Margaret, he presumed, took another step toward the curb, then stopped, her shoulders sagging. "Laurel Street," she murmured again, her voice trembling now, unmistakably frightened. Ethan tightened his grip on the handlebars, the metal cold against his palms. He didn't know why, but he couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not from this, ma'am, he said, forcing a smile. "I think I know where you need to go. It's a bit far, but we'll get there. You okay to ride with me?" Her eyes met his, uncertain but trusting, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of that trust settle over him, heavier than the wind, heavier than the ticking clock. He didn't know what lay at the end of Pinecrest Drive, but he knew he was about to find out. The wind sharpened as Ethan Carter pushed his mother's old bicycle across the cracked sidewalk of Havenwood, the rusted chain groaning with every step. The sky had turned a bruised lavender, the last light bleeding out behind the skeletal trees. and a fine mist of rain began to speckle his faded hoodie. He glanced at his phone one last time. 7:48 p.m., 12 minutes to make the delivery to Birch Street, to keep Mr. Callahan's key in his pocket, to hold on to the fragile thread of shelter. That kept him from the cold. But the woman at the bus stop, Margaret Harper, according to the pendant, stood motionless, her beige coat dampening in the drizzle, her eyes searching the empty road for a bus that wasn't coming. Ethan's chest tightened, a knot of fear and duty twisting together. He thought of his mother, Lillian, her voice echoing from a winter long past. You don't walk away from someone who's lost. He saw her face, warm but kind, tucking a blanket around him after a night shift, her hand smelling faintly of antiseptic. Then he saw Callahan's sneer, the landlord's bony finger jabbing at the eviction notice taped to the door last month. One missed payment, one late delivery, and Ethan would be out on the street, his few belongings stuffed into a plastic bag. The math was brutal. Birch Street was 10 minutes away, downhill. Pinecrest Drive was 2 hours, uphill, through roads that twisted like veins into the dark outskirts of Havenwood. Margaret shuffled forward, her small frame swaying as if the wind might tip her over. Laurel Street, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hiss of rain. I think it's Laurel, or maybe Garden. Bus 12. It should be here. Her words tumbled like loose pebbles, disjointed, frightened. Ethan's gaze flicked to the pendant again. Margaret Harper, 48 Pinecrest Drive, north side. He knew those roads, steep, unlit, flanked by frost-covered fields and crumbling stone walls. His bike, with its squeaky pedals and wobbling rack, wasn't built for that kind of journey, especially not with a passenger, especially not in the rain. He should go. He should hop on his bike, pedal hard to Birch Street, drop off the insulin, and sprint to Callahan's with the cash. But Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched her purse, and her eyes, pale, clouded, like frosted glass, met his for a moment, pleading without words. Ethan exhaled, his breath a white plume in the cold. Ma'am, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'm going to get you home. Pinecrest Drive, right? It's a bit of a ride, but we'll make it. Her face softened, a flicker of relief breaking through the confusion. Oh, thank you, dear, she said, her voice quavering. You're very kind. Like my Michael, he was always kind. She trailed off, her gaze drifting to some distant memory. Ethan didn't ask who Michael was. He didn't have time. He knelt beside his bike, tying his spare scarf of frayed, blue thing his mother had knitted around the back rack to cushion it. You can sit here, he said, patting the rack. Hold on tight, okay? We'll go slow. Margaret nodded, her movements slow and careful as she climbed onto the rack, her hands gripping Ethan's shoulders. She was lighter than he'd expected, fragile, like a bird perched on a branch. He zipped his hoodie around her shoulders, ignoring the chill that seeped into his own thin shirt. The rain was picking up now, a steady patter that slicked the pavement and stung his knuckles. He pushed off, the bike wobbling under the added weight, and began to pedal. The first few minutes were manageable, the streets of Havenwood still familiar under the dim glow of streetlights. But as they left the town center behind, the roads grew narrower, the asphalt giving way to gravel and mud. The bike's tires slipped on the wet ground, forcing Ethan to grip the handlebars harder, his arms straining. His legs burned with each turn of the pedals, the uphill slope relentless. Behind him, Margaret hummed softly, a tuneless melody that broke off whenever the bike hit a bump. Are we close? She asked, her voice small against the wind. Not yet, Ethan said, forcing a smile into his voice. Just over the next hill. He didn't tell her they had dozens of hills to go, each one steeper than the last. He didn't tell her his phone had buzzed twice in his pocket, probably Callahan demanding the rent. He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the road, on the faint glint of moonlight reflecting off the wet gravel the journey grew harder. A mile out of town, the rain thickened, soaking through Ethan's shirt and turning Margaret's coat a darker shade of beige. The bike's chain slipped once, forcing him to stop and wrestle it back into place, his fingers numb and slick. Margaret sat quietly, her hands still on his shoulders, her humming replaced by soft murmurs about a garden, a house, a boy who loved to run through the grass. Ethan listened, piecing together fragments of her life, a grandson, perhaps, or a son, someone she'd lost. Her words stirred memories of his own. Lillian teaching him to ride this very bike, her laughter echoing as he wobbled down their old street. Was that Michael? Ethan asked gently, wiping rain from his eyes as he pedaled again. The one you mentioned? Margaret's grip tightened slightly. Yes, Michael, my grandson. He had shoes like yours, always scuffed, always. Proud. She chuckled, a sound so tender it made Ethan's chest ache. He'd ride his bike everywhere, even in the rain. Said it made him feel free. Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. My mom used to say the same thing. Love this. Like, even when it started falling apart. He didn't say more, didn't trust his voice to hold steady. The road curved sharply, and a sudden dip sent the bike lurching. Margaret gasped, her fingers digging into his shoulders. Ethan swerved. To avoid a deep pothole, the bike skidding on the gravel. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought they'd crash, but he planted his foot, steadying them just in time. Sorry, ma'am, he said, breathless. You okay? I'm fine, dear, Margaret replied, her voice surprisingly calm. You're doing wonderfully. Her trust, so simple and unearned, felt heavier than the bike itself. Ethan pedaled on, his legs screaming, the cold sinking deeper into his bones. Halfway to Pinecrest, they passed a gas station, its neon sign flickering like a dying star. Ethan's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since Hank's roll, and he remembered the single dollar crumpled in his pocket. He pulled over, helping Margaret off the bike and into the small, overheated shop. With his last dollar, he bought a cup of tea, the cheapest thing on the menu, and handed it to her. Drink. This, he said. It'll warm you up. Margaret took the cup, her hands trembling slightly, then pushed it back toward him. You first, she said, her voice carrying a tender sternness that reminded him of Lillian. You need it more, riding like this in the rain. Ethan hesitated, then took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest like a small fire. He handed it back and she smiled, sipping slowly as they sat on a bench outside, the rain drumming on the awning above. You remind me of her, Ethan said, before he could stop himself. My mom. She was always looking out for people, even when we didn't have much. Margaret's eyes softened. She sounds like a good woman. You're a good boy, helping an old fool like me. She paused, her gaze distant. I used to know these streets, but tonight, they all got jumbled up. It happens, Ethan said, though he suspected it was more than that. Her confusion, her murmurs about a bus that didn't exist, hinted at something deeper, Alzheimer's maybe, or grief that muddled the mind. He didn't press her. Instead, he helped her back onto the bike, and they continued, the rain easing, but the wind growing sharper. The final stretch to Pinecrest Drive was brutal. The road climbed steeply, flanked by dark fields and skeletal trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Ethan's legs felt like lead, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Margaret's weight, light as it was, made every pedal stroke a battle. She hummed again, her voice a fragile thread in the dark, and Ethan clung to it, letting it pull him forward. We're close, he said, more to himself than to her, just over the next hill. At 9:30 p.m., the whitewashed gate of 48 Pine Crest Drive appeared, its paint chipped, ivy curling around the iron bars. Ethan's legs ached, his hands were numb, but relief flooded him as he helped Margaret off the bike. He knocked on the door, once, then again, and moments later, it swung open to reveal a man in a housecoat, his face pale with worry. "Miss Harper," he gasped, his voice trembling. "We've been calling hospitals, the police. Where have you been?" Margaret blinked, her confusion returning. "I went for a walk, or a ride, I suppose." She turned to Ethan, her smile soft. "This young man brought me home." The man, who introduced himself as Jim Larson, Margaret's caretaker, clasped Ethan's hand, his gratitude spilling over. "Come inside, please. Warm up, have some food. We'll drive you back." Ethan shook his head, exhaustion settling into his bones. "No need. I should get back before it gets colder." He scribbled his number on a torn receipt and handed it to Jim, in case she needs help again. With a final nod to Margaret, he climbed back onto his bike and pedaled into the dark. The rain a faint drizzle now, unaware that the key to his room no longer fit the lock, but also unaware that something far greater had just begun. The rain had softened to a faint drizzle by the time Ethan Carter pedaled back into Havenwood, but the cold had settled deeper, a relentless ache that clung to his skin and burrowed into his bones. The streets were empty now, the town's pulse slowed to a quiet hum under the weight of night. Streetlights cast weak, yellow pools on the wet pavement, their light fractured by the mist, and the air carried the sharp tang of wood smoke and damp earth. Ethan's legs throbbed from the 2-hour ride to Pinecrest Drive and back, each pedal stroke a reminder of the choice he'd made. His mother's old bicycle rattled beneath him, the chains squeaking in protest, the backrack still warm from where Margaret Harper had sat, her frail hands clutching his shoulders. He didn't feel heroic. He didn't feel anything but tired, the kind of tired that wasn't just physical, but carried the weight of too many days balancing survival on a frayed thread. His phone had buzzed twice during the ride, probably Mr. Callahan, the landlord, demanding the rent, but Ethan hadn't checked it. He couldn't bear to see the time, to know exactly how late he was, to confirm what he already feared. Instead, he focused on the road, on the faint glow of Havenwood Center drawing closer, on the memory of Margaret's smile when she'd said, "You brought me home." It was a small thing, that smile, but it glowed like an ember in his chest. Keeping the cold at bay, he coasted the last block to the boarding house, a narrow 2-story building with peeling paint and a porch light that hadn't worked in years. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight, as if the house itself had turned its back on him. Ethan parked his bike against the sagging railing, the tires leaving faint streaks of mud on the steps. He reached into his pocket for the key, his fingers brushing against lint, a crumpled receipt, and nothing else. His heart sank. He checked again, patting every pocket, every seam of his soaked hoodie and jeans. But the key was gone lost somewhere on the long, wet road to Pinecrest. Ethan stood there, the drizzle beating on his hood, and knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Callahan?" he called, his voice hoarse from the cold. No answer. He knocked again, louder, the sound swallowed by the night. The door didn't budge. Then his eyes caught something at the foot of the steps, a plastic grocery bag, stuffed with his belongings, a spare shirt, a worn towel, a cracked phone charger, all dumped like yesterday's trash. Taped to the door was a note, 3 words scrawled in thick black marker. "Past due." Locks changed. His breath caught, a sharp stab in his throat. He stared at the note, the words blurring as rain streaked across the paper. He'd known this was coming, had felt it in Callahan's curt warnings, in the way the man's eyes narrowed when Ethan handed over crumpled bills a day late. But seeing it, his life reduced to a soggy bag and a locked door, hit harder than he'd expected. He thought of his mother, Lillian, standing in a similar doorway 3 years ago, her face pale as they were evicted from their old apartment. She'd smiled through it, told him they'd find a way, but Ethan had seen the fear in her eyes. Now it was his turn. He didn't curse. He didn't cry. He just stood there, the bike at his side, the cold seeping into his chest. For a moment, he considered breaking the door down, but what would that solve? Callahan would call the cops, and Ethan had nowhere to go after that. Instead, he picked up the bag, slung it over his shoulder, and climbed back onto his bike. The rain had stopped, but the wind was sharper now, whistling through the bare trees, carrying the bitter scent of winter's approach. He pedaled slowly, aimlessly, because moving was better than standing still, because stillness would let the cold win. Havenwood streets were a maze of memory for Ethan. He passed the old library where Lillian used to read him stories, the diner where she bought him a milkshake on his 10th birthday, the alley where he'd learned to ride this very bike. Each corner held a piece of her, and each one reminded him why he'd stopped for Margaret. Lillian had been a nurse, always giving more than she had bandages to a neighbor, soup to a sick friend, her last dollar to a stranger on the street. "We're not rich," she'd said once, tucking him into bed, "but we've got enough to share a little light." Ethan had carried that light, even when it felt like a burden. His tires carried him to the back alley of Mitchell's Market, the corner store where Hank Mitchell sometimes let him sweep floors for a few dollars or a loaf of day-old bread. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a red glow over the dumpster and the cracked asphalt. Ethan parked his bike, his hands trembling from cold or exhaustion or both, and knocked once on the side door. A light flickered on inside, and after a long moment, the door creaked open. Hank stood there, wrapped in a heavy robe, holding a steaming mug that smelled faintly of whiskey. His eyes took in Ethan's soaked clothes, his hollow cheeks, the plastic bag slung over his shoulder. "Didn't make rent, huh?" Hank said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Ethan shook his head, unable to meet his eyes. "Lost my key. Callahan locked me out." Hank sighed through his nose, the sound of a man who'd seen too many kids like Ethan fall through the cracks. He glanced at the sky, as if expecting some divine intervention, then stepped aside. "Storeroom's dry. Cot in the corner. Don't touch the wine crates, and don't freeze to death on me." "Thanks, Hank," Ethan murmured, stepping inside. The storeroom smelled of cardboard, citrus, and faintly of mildew. The air warmed only by an old radiator that groaned like it held a grudge. The cot was thin, the blanket threadbare, but Ethan didn't care. He set his bag down, the weight of it lighter than the one in his chest, and collapsed onto the mattress. His limbs felt heavy. His shirt clung to his skin, but his heart was strangely quiet as he lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling. He thought of Margaret Harper, her frail hands, her soft humming, the way she'd pushed the tea toward him at the gas station. He thought of Lillian, too, her voice weaving through his memory. You don't walk away from someone who's lost. He'd done what she would have done, but at what cost? The key was gone, his room was gone, and tomorrow loomed like a storm cloud, full of questions he couldn't answer. Where would he sleep? How would he keep working? Would he end up like the old man he'd seen last winter, curled up in a doorway with nothing but a cardboard sheet? But then he remembered Margaret's words. "You're very kind." Like my Michael. The memory warmed him, just enough to soften the edges of his fear. He'd gotten her home, hadn't he? She was safe, her caretaker's face lit with relief. That was something. Maybe it was enough. Ethan pulled the blanket tighter, the radiators hiss a faint lullaby. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't afraid to close his eyes. The ride to Pinecrest had been grueling. The rain and the hills and the ticking clock pushing him to his limit. But it had also been something else he couldn't name yet. Margaret's hand on his shoulder, her laughter in the dark, had smoothed the jagged edges of his world. He drifted to sleep, the storeroom's walls shielding him from the wind outside. His dreams filled with the creak of his mother's bike, the glint of a silver pendant, and a voice that said, "You brought me home." Outside, Havenwood slept. Under a sky heavy with clouds, the town unaware that a small act of kindness had set something in motion, something that would ripple far beyond the cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights. Miles away, in a quiet house on Pinecrest Drive, Margaret Harper sat by her kitchen window, her coat folded in her lap, her fingers tracing the torn receipt with Ethan's number scrawled in uneven ink. She whispered his name, a soft prayer into the night, the first warm thing she'd spoken in years. The morning crept into Havenwood with a hesitant gray light, as if the sun itself was unsure whether to disturb the town's quiet slumber. In the back room of Mitchell's Market, Ethan Carter stirred on the narrow cot, the thin blanket tangled around his legs. The storeroom's air was heavy with the scent of cardboard and citrus, undercut by a faint mustiness that clung to the walls. The radiator groaned, offering little warmth against the cold that seeped through the cracked window, its glass frosted with a delicate web of ice. Ethan's body ached, a dull throb from the long ride to Pinecrest Drive and back, but deeper. Still was the weight in his chest, a quiet, familiar heaviness that came from too many mornings waking to a world that demanded more than he had to give. He rose without complaint, folding the blanket with care and tucking it against the wall, his movements silent on the linoleum floor. His sneakers, still damp from the rain, squeaked faintly as he moved to the front of the store. Hank Mitchell was already there, as always, his broad frame hunched over a ledger, a pencil tucked behind his ear. The old man's routine was a kind of faith, a stubborn insistence that the world kept turning if you showed up for it. He glanced up as Ethan approached, his eyes lingering on the boy's hollow cheeks and the plastic bag of belongings slung over his shoulder. "Coffee's on," Hank said, pushing a chipped mug and a slightly bruised banana across the counter. "Don't argue." Ethan took the banana with a quiet thanks, peeling it slowly as he stood by the window. Outside, Havenwood exhaled into motion. Steam rose from parked cars. Children shuffled along sidewalks with backpacks slung low, and a stray dog barked once before vanishing into an alley. It was just another morning, indistinguishable from the ones before it. Each day a repetition of survival deliveries, rent, the constant math of making it to tomorrow. Ethan chewed the banana, its sweetness sharp against his empty stomach, and tried not to think about the locked door at the boarding house, the key he'd lost somewhere in the rain. Then the black car pulled up. It didn't belong on Havenwood's streets, too sleek and polished, gliding to the curb with a quiet authority that made the town's faded storefronts look smaller. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, his coat too fine for a place like this, his shoes unscuffed, his posture deliberate. He held a slip of paper in his hand, glancing at it before looking through the store's window, his eyes locking onto Ethan like he'd known exactly where to find him. The bell over the door chimed, and the room seemed to shrink as he stepped inside. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice smooth but weighted, like a stone dropped into still water. "I'm looking for someone named Ethan Carter." Ethan turned from the window, his hand tightening around the banana peel. "That's me," he said cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression softened, relief flickering across his face. "My name's Jim Larson. Miss Margaret Harper sent me. She asked me to find you. She remembers everything from last night, and she wants to thank you," she insisted. He paused, his gaze steady. "She's waiting if you're willing to come." Hank paused mid-sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing but saying nothing. Ethan's heart thudded, the torn receipt with his number flashing in his mind, the one he'd scribbled for Jim last night, never expecting it to be used. He'd only wanted to make sure Margaret was safe, nothing more. The idea of going back to Pinecrest Drive, of stepping into a world that wasn't his, felt like standing barefoot on the edge of a polished stage. He was just a delivery boy with no home, no family, no future beyond the next errand. What could she want with him? I just wanted to make sure she got home, Ethan said, his voice low but firm. That's all it was. Jim regarded him for a moment, neither offended nor insistent. You did more than that, he said. She says you gave her back a piece of herself. She'd like to tell you that in person. Ethan glanced at Hank, who shrugged, his usual gruff indifference masking a flicker of concern. Go, Hank, said, waving a hand. Your cot's here if you need it. Ethan nodded, his breath feeling too large for his chest. He followed Jim to the car, a sleek sedan that smelled faintly of leather and pine. The drive to Pinecrest Drive was surreal in daylight. The trees that had loomed like shadows the night before now stood tall and bare, their branches etched against a pale sky. The hills seemed less daunting, the turns softer, but Ethan's legs remembered every pedal stroke, every stone and slope carved into his muscles. When they reached the whitewashed gate of 48 Pinecrest Drive, it looked less like a monument and more like a memory, softened by the morning light. Jim led him through a side entrance into a house that was both grand and intimate, its halls lined with old books and faded photographs, its air warmed by the scent of cedar and wax. In the sunlit sitting room, Margaret Harper waited by a window, her silver hair neatly pinned, her eyes sharp and clear, not the dazed, wandering woman from the bus stop, but someone entirely different. She wore a simple sweater, her hands folded in her lap, and when she saw Ethan, her face broke into a smile that carried the warmth of a summer dawn. You, she said, her voice trembling just enough to betray its truth. You brought me home. Ethan stood awkwardly, unsure where to put his hands. I'm glad you're okay, ma'am, he said, his voice catching. Margaret rose, her movement slow but deliberate, and reached for his hands, her grip gentle but insistent. I'm Margaret Harper, but you can call me Maggie. I remember everything, every street, every word you said. You didn't treat me like a stranger. You made me feel safe. Her eyes searched his, bright with gratitude. Please sit. Let me tell you something. Ethan sat on a plush chair, the fabric foreign against his damp jeans. Maggie settled across from him, her gaze steady. I haven't always been lost, she began, her voice soft but clear. 10 years ago, I lost my husband and my grandson. Michael, in a car accident. They were my world. Since then, the days blur, and sometimes my mind wanders like last night. The doctors call it early Alzheimer's, but I think it's just grief, holding on too tight. She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her sweater. You reminded me of Michael. He was kind, like you, always stopping for someone who needed him. Ethan's throat tightened. He thought of Lillian, her hands folding blankets, her voice urging him to share what little they had. My mom was like that, he said quietly. She passed 2 years ago. Cancer. She'd have done the same thing, stopping for you. Maggie's eyes softened, a shared understanding passing between them. Then we've both lost someone, she said. But last night, you gave me something back, a sense of being seen. I'd like to know your story, Ethan, and I'd like to help. My house has too many rooms and not enough kindness. Would you consider staying here, not just for a night, but longer? I could help you get back to school, if that's what you want. Ethan blinked, the offer catching him off guard. It was generous, too generous, and something in him resisted. He'd spent years scraping by, relying on no one, trusting only his own hands and his mother's bike. That's kind of you, ma'am, he said, his voice steady but low. But I didn't help you to get anything. I just wanted you to be safe. Maggie's smile didn't waver. And that, she said softly, is exactly why I want you to stay. The silence stretched between them, gentle but uncertain, filled with a feeling neither could name. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the garden dusted with frost and thought of the storeroom, the cot, the life he'd been clinging to. He thought of Lillian's voice, urging him to share a little light. Maybe this was what she'd meant, not just giving, but letting someone give back. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie nodded, her eyes warm with patience, and Jim handed him a folded note, a handwritten invitation to return, no strings attached. Ethan tucked it into his pocket, next to the empty space where his key used to be, and followed Jim back to the car. As they drove away, the house on Pinecrest Drive stood quiet, its windows glowing like a promise Ethan wasn't sure he could accept. The sun rose over Havenwood with a quiet insistence, its pale gold light slipping through the cracks of a fading curtain of clouds, as if the sky itself was learning to hope again. In the back room of Mitchell's Market, Ethan Carter swept the linoleum floor, the broom's soft scrape blending with the radiator's low groan. The storeroom was unchanged cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly, the faint scent of citrus and mildew lingering. But Ethan felt different, as if the weight of Margaret Harper's words had shifted something inside him. Her invitation, written in trembling ink on thick stationery, lay folded in his pocket, its words replaying in his mind. A room at her estate, a chance to return to school, a promise of support with no strings attached. It was more than he'd ever been offered, and yet it felt too large, too foreign, like a coat tailored for someone else's life. He set the broom against the wall and stepped into the front of the store, where Hank Mitchell was sorting cans of soup with the same stoic precision he brought to every morning. The old man glanced up, his eyes lingering on Ethan's face, which was less hollow today, though still shadowed by exhaustion. "You look like you're thinking too hard," Hank said, tossing a rag across the counter. "Wipe the counter. It'll keep your head quiet." Ethan caught the rag with a faint smile, the routine grounding him. As he wiped down the counter, the bell over the door jingled, not the usual impatient clatter of a customer, but a soft, deliberate chime that made him pause. He looked up, and there she was, Margaret Harper, standing in the doorway, her wool shawl wrapped neatly over her shoulders, a small leather handbag tucked into the crook of her arm. She was alone this time, no sleek car or caretaker, just Maggie, her eyes searching the room until they found him. Her smile was warm, like sunlight breaking through fog, and Ethan straightened instinctively, his hands wiping unconsciously on his jeans. "I hope you don't mind me coming again," Maggie said, her voice softer than the morning light. "I've been thinking about you all night." "I suppose that sounds strange, but I mean it kindly." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Not strange," he said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "It's nice to see you, ma'am." She stepped closer, her gaze steady but gentle, as if she sensed the storm of thoughts behind his eyes. "I've lived in that big house for a long time," she began, her words careful, like stones placed in a stream. "It's never felt so quiet as it did this morning. Not even after my husband passed. Not even after Michael." She paused, her fingers tightening around her handbag. "You remind me of him. You know his kindness, his quiet way of listening. When you helped me that night, without asking for anything, something in me woke up. Something that's been asleep for years." Ethan looked down, his fingers curling against the counter's edge. He didn't know how to carry her words, so heavy with meaning, so light with hope. He thought of Lillian, his mother, her hands folding blankets, her voice urging him to share what little they had. Maggie's kindness felt like an echo of that. But accepting it meant stepping into a world he'd never trusted one, where people gave without expecting something in return. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, its edges worn, but the ink steady. "This isn't a contract," she said, her voice firm now. "It's not a deal or an arrangement. It's an invitation. My home has too many rooms and too few reasons to keep them open. I'd like you to stay, Ethan, just until you find your footing. And if you want to go back to school, I'd like to help with that too." She hesitated, then added, "No strings, only support." Ethan took the note, his fingers brushing against hers, and unfolded it slowly. It was simple, handwritten. An offer to stay at her estate, a modest monthly stipend, and, in softer script, a promise. "We'll find a way for you to return to school, if that's what you want." The words blurred slightly, not from rain this time, but from the weight of possibility. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and saw no judgment, only a quiet hope that felt both foreign and familiar. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice low. Nobody's ever done something like this for me." "You don't have to say anything," Maggie replied. "Just think about it. The door's open when you're ready." Before Ethan could respond, the bell jingled again, and Lila Torres stepped into the store. Lila was a delivery worker like Ethan, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, her jacket patched at the elbows. They'd worked together on late-night runs, sharing stale coffee and stories of Havenwood's quirks. But today her eyes narrowed as she took in Maggie's shawl, her polished handbag, the air of quiet wealth that clung to her. "Hey, Ethan," Lila said, her tone sharp. "Callahan's telling everyone you got evicted. You okay?" Ethan's cheeks burned, the humiliation fresh. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied, tucking Maggie's note into his pocket. "Just figuring things out." Lila's gaze flicked to Maggie, then back to Ethan. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Maggie smiled, unruffled. "I'm Margaret Harper. Ethan helped me get home the other night. I came to thank him." Lila's eyebrows shot up. "Helped you? That why he missed his delivery? Why he's sleeping in a storeroom now?" Her words were blunt, cutting, and Ethan flinched, the truth of them stinging. "Lila," he said quietly, "it's not like that." "Isn't it?" she pressed, crossing her arms. "You're out here playing hero, and now you're homeless. What's she offering you, huh? Charity? A pat on the head?" Maggie's expression didn't falter, but her eyes softened with understanding. "I'm offering a chance," she said simply, "because he gave me one." Lila snorted, but Ethan saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She turned to him, her voice lower now. "Just be careful, Ethan. People like her don't give something for nothing. You're too good for that." The words lingered as Lila left, the bell's chime fading into silence. Ethan stared at the counter, Lila's warning clashing with Maggie's offer, with the memory of his mother's voice. Share a little light. He'd always trusted his own hands, his own work, but Maggie's invitation felt like a door he'd never dared to open. Was it charity? Pity? Or something else, something he couldn't name but felt in the warmth of her smile? "I should go," Maggie said, sensing his turmoil. "But the offer stands. Come when you're ready." She pressed a card into his hand, her address, her number, and left, a shawl catching the morning light as she stepped outside. Ethan stood there, the card heavy in his palm, until Hank cleared his throat. "She's right, you know," he said, his voice gruff. "I'd passed up a chance like that once. Thought I was too proud. Don't make my mistake, kid." Ethan didn't answer, but the words settled into him, heavy and true. That afternoon, Jim Larson arrived with the black car, not with ceremony, but with quiet insistence, as Maggie had asked. Ethan packed his few belongings, his mother's scarf, the cracked phone charger, a photo of Lillian smiling into a worn backpack. Hank handed him a paper bag of sandwiches, muttering, "About time," and Ethan climbed into the car. The leather seats smelling of pine and possibility. The drive to Pinecrest Drive was a blur. The hills softer in daylight, the trees less foreboding. When they reached the estate, Ethan stepped into a room that felt like a dream. Sunlit, with a wide window overlooking a garden dusted with frost, a bed with clean sheets, a shelf of books that smelled of old paper and promise. Maggie greeted him not as a guest, but as family, her smile steady, her voice warm. "This is yours," she said, gesturing to the room, "for as long as you need it." That night, Ethan lay in the bed, the silence of the house vast but not empty. He thought of Lila's warning, of Hank's gruff advice, of Lillian's voice, urging him to share light. He thought of Maggie, her eyes bright with a hope he hadn't seen in years. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was running from something: poverty, loss, the cold. He felt like he was running towards something, though he didn't know what it was yet. The sky over Havenwood soft as spring crept in, its pale blue streaked with wisps of cloud that drifted like afterthoughts. The frost that had clung to the town's edges for months was giving way. The grass along Pinecrest Drive now dusted with the first green of the season. In the sunlit room at Margaret Harper's estate, Ethan Carter sat at a small wooden desk, a notebook open before him, its pages filled with ideas scribbled in his uneven handwriting. The room was simple but warm, with a wide window overlooking Maggie's garden, where crocuses poked through the soil, defiant and bright. The bed was neatly made, the shelves lined with books. Ethan had begun to read novels, histories, a guide to community organizing that Maggie had left for him with a quiet smile. It was a far cry from the storeroom at Mitchell's Market, with its groaning radiator and threadbare cot. And yet Ethan still felt the weight of that place, a reminder of where he'd been just weeks ago. Life at the estate was not extravagant, but it was peaceful, a rhythm Ethan was learning to trust. Maggie had given him more than a room. She'd given him time, space, a chance to breathe without the constant math of survival. Mornings were spent walking with her in the greenhouse, where she taught him to tend her roses, her hands steady as she showed him how to prune without wounding. Afternoons were for reading, for catching up on the schooling he'd abandoned after his mother's death. Maggie had arranged a scholarship in the name of her grandson, Michael, through a quiet fund she'd set up with her wealth. Ethan had enrolled in the local community college, his first classes starting in a month, and the thought of it sitting in a classroom, a pencil in his hand, felt like a dream he hadn't dared to imagine. Their evenings were filled with tea and conversation, Maggie's stories of her past weaving with Ethan's memories of Lillian. They spoke of loss, her husband and grandson, his mother, and of the small acts of kindness that had kept them going. "Michael used to love this garden," Maggie said one night, her voice soft as she stirred her tea. "He'd run through it laughing, not caring about the mud on his shoes. You have that same spark, Ethan, that same heart." Ethan ducked his head, the praise too heavy for his shoulders. "I'm just trying to do right by you," he said, "like my mom would have." Maggie's eyes crinkled. "You're doing more than that. You're building something new." That something was the Beacon Hope Fund, a dream born from their late-night talks, from the shared belief that kindness could be more than a moment. It could be a movement. The fund's mission was simple: to support young people with potential, but no path, to shelter the elderly who'd slipped through the cracks, to remind Havenwood that dignity and care were not luxuries, but birthrights. Ethan threw himself into it, meeting with counselors, sketching out programs, and helping renovate a dilapidated community center on the edge of town. Maggie's wealth funded it, but her trust in Ethan gave it life. She never treated him like a project, never paraded his story. Instead, she welcomed him into her days, her home, her heart, as if he'd always belonged there. One afternoon, as Ethan biked into town to drop off flyers for the fund's first outreach event, he passed the old bus stop where it all began. The bench was still sagging, the sidewalk still cracked, but it felt different now, like a marker of something sacred. He slowed, his tires humming on the pavement, and spotted a familiar figure leaning against the lamppost. Lila Torres, her delivery bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she saw him. "Fancy bike ride for a big shot," Lila called, her tone half teasing, half sharp. She'd been distant since their last encounter, her skepticism about Maggie's offer lingering like a bruise. Ethan stopped, resting one foot on the ground. "Same old bike," he said, patting the rusted frame. "Just going to the community center. Got some flyers for a thing we're starting." Lila raised an eyebrow. "We? You and that rich lady? What's the deal, Ethan? You her charity case now?" The words stung, but Ethan held her gaze. "It's not like that," he said. "She's helping me. Yeah, but we're helping others too. Kids like us, people who don't have anyone. You should come see it." Lila hesitated, her arms crossing tighter. "I don't know, man. Sounds too good to be true." "It's not perfect," Ethan admitted. "But it's real. Come by the center tomorrow. See for yourself." She didn't answer, but her eyes softened, and as Ethan pedaled away, he felt a flicker of hope that she'd show up. The next day, she did, standing awkwardly at the edge of the community center's open house, where Ethan and Maggie welcomed Havenwood's residents to learn about the fund. Lila listened as Ethan explained the program's scholarships, job training, support for the elderly, and by the end, she offered to help distribute flyers, her skepticism giving way to curiosity. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, a bridge between the life Ethan had known and the one he was building. Weeks turned into months, and the Beacon Hope Fund grew, its impact rippling through Havenwood. The community center became a hub, filled with voices and laughter, with kids studying in the evenings and seniors sharing stories over coffee. Ethan worked part-time there, his college classes a quiet thrill, his nights spent planning with Maggie. He still rode his mother's bike, not because he had to, but because it reminded him of where he'd started, of the cold night at the bus stop, of a choice that had changed everything that one evening. As summer bloomed and the garden glowed with fireflies, Ethan passed the bus stop again. He slowed, his tires whispering on the pavement, and tipped his head to the sky, a small smile breaking across his face. Maggie was at home, writing a letter he'd find later, tucked into his notebook. "Ethan, you brought me home, not just to my house, but to myself. Thank you for sharing your light." He didn't know it yet, but that letter would become his anchor, a reminder that home wasn't a place but a feeling, built from the people you chose to walk with in the dark. Sometimes you don't find home, it finds you. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is the willingness to stop, to see someone clearly, and to ride a little farther than you planned. The story of Ethan Carter and Margaret Harper is a testament to the power of small acts of kindness. How a single moment of compassion can ripple outward, transforming lives and communities. Ethan's decision to help Maggie, despite the cost to himself, reflects a universal truth. Kindness is not a transaction, but a gift, one that returns in ways we cannot predict. Their journey reminds us that connection between generations, between strangers, can heal the wounds of loss and loneliness, building bridges where walls once stood. The Beacon Hope Fund embodies this, showing that dignity and opportunity are not privileges but rights, accessible when we choose to see and support one another. This story also teaches us resilience. Ethan's struggles, poverty, loss, the weight of survival mirror the challenges many face, yet his choice to act with compassion, even at his lowest, shows that our capacity to give endures beyond our circumstances. Maggie's transformation, from a grieving woman lost in her memories to a beacon of purpose, underscores that it's never too late to find meaning through connection. Together, they remind us that family is not just born but chosen, forged in moments of trust and care. We invite you to join us at Legacy Stories, where we share tales of humanity, hope, and the small acts that change the world. Hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy. Share your own stories of kindness in the comments, because every light you share can illuminate someone's path.